Calcutta, Fort William, 1786. The employees of the British East India Company prepare for the arrival of the new Governor-General. The air is tense. They know the company is already in trouble back in London, and that the new appointee is not a merchant, but a military man. Sure enough, when he arrives, his predecessor greets him with a formal ceremony, but none of it shields him from the incoming Governor-General's look of contempt. The company is now under new, very different management. Hello, welcome back to Secondhand History and part 2 of our series on Charles Cornwallis. Last time, Cornwallis' surrender at Yorktown in 1781 had cemented the outcome of the American Revolution. With war still ongoing with France and Spain, the question had changed from how to put down the revolt to how much else Britain might lose. The British ultimately managed to defend most of their other colonial possessions until peace came in 1783, but the empire's overall situation still felt precarious. Parliament caved to Irish demands for legislative autonomy, fearing what might happen otherwise, and in India, the British East India Company hemorrhaged money. Fortunately for Cornwallis, it was common practice at the time for captured officers to be paroled and sent home, so Cornwallis parted with his army and set sail for England. His former superior, Henry Clinton, also returned, and the first matter of business was who was at fault for Britain's defeat. Clinton turned to the press to blame his subordinate, but in the end, the king and public largely sided with Cornwallis. Still, for several years, Cornwallis mostly returned to a quiet life in England, but in 1786, he accepted a new commission to serve as Governor-General of India and set sail. After a 3-month voyage, Cornwallis arrived in the colonial Indian city of Madras, now Chennai, and made his way to British India's de facto capital in Calcutta. He assessed the local administration and quickly disliked what he saw. At the time, Britain ruled its colonial possessions in India indirectly through the aptly named East India Company. Founded almost 2 centuries earlier as a genuine, albeit semi-militarized, trading venture, the East India Company had held a small presence in India since 1608 with the permission of the Indian Mughal Empire, but in the mid-18th century, the effective collapse of Mughal power, and a pair of key military victories, suddenly elevated the company into one of the subcontinent's most important powers. However, governing brought new challenges. By the 1770s, a large fraction of Bengal's population was dead from famine, the company was deeply in debt, and tales of its corruption reached as far as colonial America. Finally, the British still did not control all of India, and had to contend with powerful local states that could, and often did, hold their own against the East India Company. Rising tensions with one state in particular, the Kingdom of Mysore, made future war almost inevitable. Cornwallis went to work. The first order of business was to rein in corruption. He forbade under-the-table commercial activity and encouraged his colleagues to cut down on their often lavish lifestyles, but turning a profit was a secondary matter for the Governor-General. His real aim was to consolidate British India from a haphazard corporate acquisition into a coherent colony for a revitalized British Empire. To this end, Cornwallis overhauled the legal codes and tried to better integrate the company's private army with that of the Crown, with limited results. He also forbade Indians from the highest positions of the colonial bureaucracy, but not necessarily because of racism in and of itself, according to his biographers. They point to a number of charitable actions to help the native population. Rather, he simply saw Indian society and people as innately, who are we kidding, it was racism. Cornwallis viewed Britain's non-white subjects with a kind of aloof paternalism. Attitudes aside, Cornwallis's arguably most important achievement from an imperial perspective was the deal he struck with the zamindars, an influential class of quasi-feudal tax collectors who had served India's previous rulers. Although they acknowledged British authority and lacked the strength to challenge it directly, trust was in short supply, and losing their cooperation en masse would have been disastrous for the fledgling colonial administration. Under the deal, the zamindars would become the hereditary landlords of their assigned areas and had to pay a fixed portion of the rent they collected to the British. The rest, they kept, and the British would provide military security. No private armies were allowed. Cornwallis remembered how local militias worked out in America. Known as permanent settlement, this deal had its growing pains, and if it sounds right for abuse of the peasantry, that's because it was. Still, it elevated a class of local elites whose success depended on British authority, helping to reinforce colonial rule for years to come. But in 1789, reform suddenly took a back seat when tensions with Mysore finally erupted in war. Mysore's ruler, Tipu Sultan, hated the British and practically grew up fighting them during their two previous wars with his father, Hyder Ali. The last war in particular left both sides dissatisfied, and when one of Mysore's neighbors allied with Britain and gave shelter to Mysorean rebels, Tipu attacked. Britain declared war, and round 3 began. Cornwallis formed a temporary alliance with the two other big regional powers, the Maratha Confederacy and the Nizam of Hyderabad, and sent one of his subordinates to lead the East India Company's army into Mysore. The company's military was a mixture of European regulars employed by the company or the crown itself, and sepoys, Indian soldiers trained and led by British officers. Tipu's forces were more variable, ranging from disciplined musketeers and soldiers with state-of-the-art rocketry weapons to men with spears. Regardless, indecision and communication difficulties plagued the company's expeditionary force, and Mysorean counterattacks soon forced Cornwallis' subordinate into headlong retreat. Watching as Tipu began raiding British-held territory, the Governor-General perhaps remembered the chain of command issues that plagued Britain in America and decided to lead from the front. Upon assuming direct command of the army, Cornwallis gathered his supplies and went on the attack. Tipu fell back into a defensive position, but Cornwallis bypassed him and took a roundabout path directly into Mysore's heartland. The plan worked. By the time Tipu realized that he'd been duped and scrambled back to defend his kingdom, it was too late to stop the British, and by the spring of 1791, Cornwallis had besieged and captured the critical fort city of Bangalore. From there, it was only a short, easy journey to the Mysorean capital, Seringapatam. Well, at least that was the plan. Things didn't quite work out that way. As Cornwallis' original supplies began to dwindle, Tipu employed a scorched earth strategy to leave nothing for British foragers. The weather then turned foul. When Cornwallis linked up with the detachment sent by his ally Hyderabad, he not only disliked them, but learned that they needed supplies too. Although Cornwallis defeated Tipu Sultan at the Battle of Arikara, Tipu's army escaped intact to his capital's defenses, and Cornwallis' men were in no state to lay siege. Reluctantly, he withdrew to Bangalore, a heavy setback soon immortalized by Britain's early political cartoonists. Just to add a second insult to injury, a few days into the retreat, a messenger from Cornwallis' other native allies, the Marathas, arrived and told him that their own army was just outside Seringapatam, ready and well-provisioned for combined assault. Cornwallis had just dismantled his all-important heavy siege guns. Arrgh! Now Cornwallis was pissed. Back in Bangalore, Cornwallis prepared for a second campaign. This time, he took every precaution. He accumulated more supplies than he could ever need. He relegated native allies he deemed unreliable to secondary roles. Taking a moment to seize several forts threatening his lines for resupply from Madras, Cornwallis made his way back to Tipu's capital and again found his enemy camped in front of the city. Without telling his allies his plan, Cornwallis decided to launch a three-pronged night attack. The attack triggered a fierce melee, but although outnumbered, the uniformly disciplined British troops eventually broke Tipu Sultan's mixed-quality soldiers. The Mysorean forces retreated behind the walls, Cornwallis called forth his allies to lay siege, and Tipu Sultan capitulated. The resulting peace treaty stripped Mysore of half of its land and forced Tipu Sultan to ransom his two sons. the East India Company became India's preeminent military power. After the war, Cornwallis wrapped up his term as Governor-General and returned home in 1793. He left behind the East India Company in a far stronger and more secure position than he had found it, and despite India's far greater population, Britain's power there would steadily grow until it effectively ruled the entire subcontinent by the mid-19th century. In retrospect, Cornwallis benefited from one major advantage that he lacked in America. Unlike the 13 colonies whose population rallied together, the East India Company's rivals and subjects had no such sense of unity. However, while we can speculate about Cornwallis's push for centralized British authority in India and his distrust of local allies, it is risky to try to draw too many definitive connections to his experiences in America. But we also can't rule it out. What we can say is that if Cornwallis saw the fall of the First British Empire in America, he helped lay the Second Empire's foundation in India. Thank you for watching, please like and subscribe, and join us for part 3, where Cornwallis returns to a Europe gripped by revolution and finds himself in Ireland as long-standing grievances come to a head.